Kim was asking about the use of qualitative evidence to address questions around non-interventional research, and we put a little bit of response in the chat about that. And we reassured her that you certainly could, that if it was around prognostic or diagnostic test accuracy reviews, it might be about acceptability or feasibility. So we can probably cover that question off. Donald asked some questions about clarifying what was mixed methods research, and does this integration research count as mixed method? James sort of covered that one off. So James, I don't know whether you wanted to further clarify.
Only to say that mixed methods research has a distinguished and quite a long history in primary research, especially in social science, and we have used the phrase mixed methods synthesis at times, but we tend not to, on the whole, as a blanket term, because some of what we're talking about, as you and Andrew put in the chat, is broader than the way that mixed methods in terms of primary research conceptualizes what's going on. And so we tend to use it quite precisely if we are referring to that sort of school of thought thinking, but otherwise we tend not to. And I know that I mentioned a chapter, I think Fahid was interested in the chapter, so I'm going to see if I can track it down. It is a little while since Angela and I wrote that chapter on where we reflected on sort of combining different types of evidence in systematic reviews with that sort of paradigm of mixed methods thinking.
And then we have two QCA related questions. Kim asked, how are these QCA factors chosen? Are they from the QES, the qualitative evidence synthesis evidence alone? That was one question. And then Emma asked, if you have an intervention effects review with a large N, for example, 100 trials, is there a less time consuming way than to go through QCA trial by trial? So they might be more towards you, James, but Angela, do chip in.
Yeah, I can just respond on the first one quickly, which obviously in the example I presented of QCA, the features were identified through the qualitative evidence synthesis and then tested through the trials, but that wouldn't be the only way of identifying the features. But yeah, obviously doing it through a qualitative evidence synthesis means that it's very empirically grounded rather than, say, relying on stakeholder views.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks, Angela.
Am I working?
You're working perfectly, James.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that QCA can be used in at least two different ways. One is around sort of understanding the pathways to effect, but another use of QCA has been in terms of developing typologies and taxonomies, and for that kind of purpose, we've used evidence from not just the QES. We've used whatever evidence we can get our hands on. And the other question was about large N QCA, wasn't it? It was about, can you do it? Is there a less time-consuming way of doing it? I don't think anyone would accuse QCA of being a labor-saving device on the whole. It does tend to involve quite a lot of time and effort from what we've come across, or from our experience anyway. Having said that, there is this thing called large N QCA, which has been used more in primary research, where people have had thousands of cases. I mean, obviously, when you've got that number, you don't look in the same kind of depth at each individual case. So, I think that there are strengths to QCA that go beyond the sort of the single case analysis, which lend itself towards being used in large N scenarios. But the thing about having 100 trials is that's kind of in between the two. I don't know whether. I think probably you'd find with 100 trials, you've just got to do really quite detailed data extraction. It's not going to be a quick activity, but it can still be useful to do.
Yes, and choose your methods when you know how many trials you've got. So back to Natalia. Natalia's asked a question about how do you deal with the problem with quant and qual data coming from different studies or interventions? Does it mean that you can only integrate quant with qual evidence coming from the same study, such as with an RCT with an embedded process evaluation? Now, Andrew's also answered that question in the chat, and I think Andrew's answer is really good. I just wanted to add, Natalia, that we did write some guidance. We called them trial sibling studies versus non-trial sibling studies, and we wrote some guidance in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. So if you look up Noyes and Booth and trial sibling studies, you'll find a paper on that that will give you some guidance as to what to do. And then Natalia goes on to have a lovely additional question. Angela, this is probably one for you. Could you talk about results and findings transformation prior to integration? Is it essential?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what type of approach you're using. I mean, we tend to talk about rather than the individual studies transforming findings, we're looking at the actual results of the syntheses and trying to integrate the results of the syntheses rather than the individual studies. So I guess the transformation there is about it's about trying to identify where the two sets of findings speak to each other, and obviously in a Cochrane context, in a policy context, it is about a particular policy, a particular intervention. So I suppose the point of connection between the different types of studies is what each evidence type is able to say about that policy and intervention. And quite often what happens in a qualitative evidence synthesis, as you've been hearing about in previous webinars, is theory development. So your qualitative evidence syntheses is a set of theories, if you like, or a set of hypotheses about a particular intervention or about a way that a health condition is experienced. Which you can then is relatable. I suppose that's the transformation in the way you transformed it onto a theoretical level, which you can then connect with the findings from your effectiveness synthesis in terms of, do those trials test particular theories within those interventions, and that's the way I think you get them to speak to each other. I think there has been approaches tried where, for example, in a Bayesian approach, where qualitative findings are translated into numeric values. People have experimented with qualitative effect sizes, but certainly in terms of the types of integration that we're particularly advocating from the qualitative and implementation methods group, I think theory is the key way of transforming findings.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. And welcome back, Fareed. Nice to have another question from you. Fareed's asking, has the MRC process evaluation framework been combined with QCA?
That's a great question. We've certainly used QCA in the light of our knowledge of the MRC process evaluation framework, but I don't think we've ever used that framework on its own and explicitly just in the QCA. So I don't know if someone has done that explicitly. We've tended to use it as one of the tools that have informed, the way that we understand, process evaluations. I think it would be an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Fareed. Andrew's just put the paper in the chat about trial sibling studies and unrelated qualitative studies. So that's quite a good read to explain some of the test cases that we've done to try out whether it's possible or not. Amanda is asking, are you aware of any integration of QES and policy analyses?
I'm not aware of nothing. I may be misunderstanding the question, but I'm not. Nothing springs to mind, Amanda, in terms of that.
We often include qualitative components, primary qualitative research and policy analyses, though, don't we, and implementation studies of policy, and that data could be contribute to a subsequent qualitative evidence synthesis. So, I mean, I guess it is possible, and I guess also we can have we can do these mega qualitative reviews now, so reviews of reviews that contribute to policy analyses.
I mean, qualitative evidence synthesis is a good way of analysing policy.
So I hope that helps, Amanda. Okay, I think that's all the questions for now. I'd just ask if you've got any final questions, because we have got probably a couple of minutes before we hand back to Dario. Amanda says thank you very much. If there aren't any more questions, then we can hand back to Dario, or ask Angela and James if they got any final comments on the questions that you've had, or anything that you'd like to conclude with.
I liked what Angela said about finding a way of getting the studies to speak to each other. I think that's one of the keys in terms of doing a sort of like a synthesis where you're combining evidence from different types of studies. Is thinking about how that you can find a sort of like a connection. It's like linking data sets in other areas, but you've got to think about how they actually work together. And also that we tend to not qualitize quantitative findings and the other way around. We tend to say, well, okay, so we've got qualitative research and that's good for one thing. We've got quantitative research and that's good for, you know, what it's good for. And we tend to sort of try and get the best from both. And then the idea then is to combine them in a way which actually then gives us, you know, the old cliche of being the sum, you know, being greater than the sum of its parts, etc. So yeah, I think the getting them to speak to each other is a great way to think about what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, last word to Angela.
Yeah, I mean, I think the observation about the mixed methods and why we didn't use the term mixed methods is really interesting. And I think over time, I think the term mixed methods has perhaps become less useful because it is quite imprecise as a way of describing things. So that was our deliberate move away from not calling things mixed methods. So yeah, something to think about for the future in terms of how this is branded, badged.